Hey guys, this is Mark Howard, author of the Griffin Legends fantasy novel series. Thanks for joining me here today. I ran into this interesting post on the internet asking whether or not you should allow players to die in the game Dungeons and Dragons or not. Now, a lot of you are probably familiar with my own affinity for this game. I played it a lot as a kid. I used it as some loose inspiration for my own fantasy writings, as a lot of authors tend to do when writing in a fantasy genre. And I have more recently got my kids involved in this game. So naturally, when I saw this post about asking whether or not you should allow your characters to die in this game, I felt that I had some relatively strong opinions worth sharing. So here we go. As a very brief overview, for those of you not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, which I'm sure most of you probably are familiar with it, but Dungeons & Dragons is right now the most popular tabletop role-playing game out there. There are other strong competitors. Some people out there will have favorites that are not Dungeons & Dragons, but Dungeons & Dragons is one of the oldest, and it has, since right or wrong, received a lot of popularity. Now, central to the game of Dungeons & Dragons is every player, you, me, your friends, whoever else, takes on the role of a single character, right? This could be a warrior of some sort, a wizard, a thief, ranger, a lot of different kinds of fantasy characters that you then form a group with and run all of these little narrative-driven adventures with. Now, the origins of Dungeons & Dragons are actually based in a much older kind of game called tabletop war games. Things like Warhammer or Battletech, where you get whole armies of little figurines and you roll dice and try to blow up the other guy's army with them. So Dungeons & Dragons, coming from that sort of origins, has a lot of rules about fighting monsters and how these fights are supposed to be adjudicated. So back to the crux of the matter, should your characters be allowed to die? Well, on the one hand, you want to have kind of this element of continuity in this story that you and your friends are crafting, right? And so from that perspective, it might not make sense to have a character die unless there was some reason in the narrative why that character should die. But on the other hand, there is this very strong tabletop war game element built into the rules where you roll all these dice, and these dice are supposed to mean something, right? Not just success for your characters, like how hard you hit the Cyclops or whatever, but also the inverse. How much damage do you take, up to and including your character's death? And so, while in my own fantasy writings, I try not to kill characters unless it's somewhat poignant, or at minimum, unless I'm sure that I don't want this character to come back and they're okay dying, right? So on the one hand, we have that element, but on the other hand, what do dice rolls mean in a dice rolling game if you are not going to abide by what the dice tell you to do? And so this becomes a very heated debate in some circles here. In fact, I'd introduced some friends to this game when my wife and I were first married, and one of my friends, his wife, was playing with us, and she got extremely upset when I rolled the dice, when a monster attacked her, and her character died. That was it. The dice rolls were really bad for her, really good for the monster, and her character died. And she was extremely upset by this. And I was kind of blown back, to be honest, because she thought that somehow I was supposed to ask for her permission before rolling these dice and determining whether or not her character would live or die, right? And in a certain sense, I didn't really have control over her character dying, right? I was just doing what the dice said to do. But my take on this here, as far as whether or not characters in role-playing games should die or should not die, is that the higher the risk, the greater the reward, right? We can all tell this collaborative story in a role-playing game, and that's all good and well. That can be a lot of fun, right? But if we are to accept that in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, where most of your character options are things that are meant to do a lot of fighting, and the general stakes of the setting are you win and beat the monster and take its treasure, or the monster kills you and you have to start over with a new character with a little less treasure than the last character started off with, it seems to me that the better answer is to allow the dice to roll and accept it to a large degree, right? In my first Dungeons and Dragons group that I played in, our dungeon master, the guy who was running all the monsters and mazes and all the challenges and whatnot, he was a fairly hard dungeon master in a sense that he never really cut the players a good break, and a lot of our characters tended to die. Now, we were all high school kids at the time, and so maybe we weren't playing as smart as we could have. In fact, there were a lot of funny stories about how some of our characters were killed by our own idiocy. But still, my character that I played in that game was one of the few to last basically from start to finish, right? A lot of my friends made these characters that would die and they have to roll a new character, and it happened every week or two for some of them. But I felt really accomplished just based on the fact that my character had survived where so many others had fallen. And even to this day, I take some pride in that, knowing that I had this incredible challenge put in front of my character, and this character made it through. So that's my take on it. What do you guys think? Should Dungeons & Dragons lean more into its wargaming roots, where characters will frequently get killed and you have to roll a new character and that's just part of the nature of the game? Or should it be more on this narrative-driven side, where it is something that characters should rarely, if ever, die, and it's all some sort of a Shakespearean drama where we're trying to tease out some greater truths that we don't need to necessarily explore death in that? Anyway, let me know what you think either way on that. As usual, like, share, subscribe, and make a comment. Let me know what you guys think. All right, take care now.